Good evening, everybody. I hope you are warm and cozy in on this cold, rainy day. My name is Eli Fishpaw, the host for the Rockbridge Conservation Seminar Series. Ellie Moss of Perpetual, a nonprofit promoting returnable restaurant containers, among other things, is our guest tonight. Before we start our presentation, I want to announce our two programs that we have planned. On Wednesday, January 18th, in our new year of 2023, Jared Lee of Southern Virginia University's Biology Program Coordinator will be speaking generally on the hazards posed by invasive species in Rockbridge area with an emphasis on kudzu. And on Wednesday, February 15th, Sarah Coffey will be describing her work with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation to negotiate agreements for grant recipients with waterfront property to hire contractors to restore riparian buffers in the Rockbridge and several adjacent counties. Sarah is a recipient of the Rockbridge Conservation 2022 Conservation Impact Award. Our Waste Prevention Committee advocates for a circular economy where the residue of one process is the food for another process. The residue becomes waste only if we mismanage it. In tonight's program, we are considering the potential for returnable restaurant carryout containers. In April of every year, Rockbridge Conservation leads a litter cleanup campaign. We are commonly picking up restaurant carryout containers. The past few years, we have emphasized to the public the devastating impact litter has on the marine environment, where it eventually ends up. I expect that our participants tonight already know that. We can do better. Ellie has been working on solutions as a plastic waste problem since she was the lead author of Sea of Opportunity in 2017. Since then, her work has included The Dirty Truth About Disposable Foodware, Living Landscape of Reusable Solutions, and other work includes Reducing Plastic Pollution campaigns that work, advising Morgan Stanley on their plastic waste resolution, and working with Reusable Packaging Association. As always, we are here to learn. Therefore, Rockbridge Conservation cannot yet advocate for all the points we may hear tonight. However, we are open to the possibility of systemic changes to our culture that supports preventing waste in a circular economy. Ellie will pause intermittently for questions. You can enter your questions in the chat, and Barbara will be monitoring them. So Ellie, let's see what you got to say.
Thank you so much, Eli. It's a real pleasure to be able to speak to you all this evening. And as Eli said, feel free to jump in at any point if you're interested in asking a question. And I'll start just with a quick introduction of, I think, Eli, you did a very good job introducing me. So I've been working in the reusable space for quite a number of years now, and have also just been working in the broader plastic solution space, for quite a while. So this topic is obviously the area where I'm most focused right now, and I'm super excited to talk to you all about reuse, but questions that sort of put reuse in the broader context are also fair game if those are of interest. Perpetual is a nonprofit that I started with a group of colleagues earlier this year. We got our first grant in February, so that's sort of when we officially think of ourselves as starting. And we are focused, as you can see, on partnering at the city level to design and support the implementation of reuse systems, starting with foodware. We'll get to sort of Perpetual's focus later in the presentation, but it's always nice to know sort of who you're talking to and why. So I wanted to start with a quick introduction of Perpetual, and then we'll talk just a lot about reusable foodware. I'll share some examples, share a little bit about, I think, what we're learning as a community about, what is working and not working in reuse. What are some of the design decisions that we have to collectively tackle, so that you all can think about what might make sense for your businesses, for your community, and for all of you. So with all of that said, I'll just start with a slide I know that we probably don't need, because as Eli mentioned, we're all, I'm sure, on this call quite aware, but plastic pollution is kind of only getting worse based on all of the different trajectory numbers you might want to look at or not want to look at, depending on how you feel about it. This particular graphic actually comes from the Breaking the Plastic Wave report, which was released by the Pew Charitable Trust a couple of years ago. I was an advisor on that report, along with many, many other very smart and esteemed folks. And the business as usual scenario is quite grim. What I take hope from is just the fact that there is such an upwelling of support for solutions. And I think people are really hungry for choices. I personally feel frustrated when I go to a restaurant or I go to a grocery store, I go somewhere and I don't have a choice. There's no alternative. And so that's, really what we're focused on is how can we, if they have the option, 80% of consumers in this said if given the option to buy goods that don't use plastic packaging, they will. And so that's really what, that's the beacon of hope, I think, that we're focused on. That same report did model a range of different solutions. So there was very detailed modeling of all the different solutions you can see on the right side here. So different disposal options for waste, recycling options for waste, substitution options, and then reduction options. Reuse falls into the reduce category because you're just eliminating the need for something in the first place. And if you notice on this quite beautiful graph, I think I didn't make it, but I think it's one of the prettier charts for such a tricky topic. Reuse actually has the greatest potential as a single solution to contribute to reductions in plastic waste over the next 15 to 20 years. Just to explain the difference, you can see there's reuse consumer and then reuse new delivery models. Reuse consumer means I bring my own bag, I bring my own cup, I bring my own container. Reuse new delivery models is systems where there is a program or some sort of a business or something in place that facilitates reuse. So it's not on me to remember my cup. It's I borrow a cup, I return the cup to the system, the cup circulates again and again. But collectively, it's a huge opportunity. And so we're just really excited about the potential that reuse has and its significance in the context of the other solutions to plastic waste. We actually do also see reuse as complementary with some of these other solutions. A lot of the contamination in the recycling stream is disposable foodware that is not recyclable. And so if we can start displacing some of the non-recyclable single-use plastic, that is good, with reusables. That's good because we're not using that, but it's also actually good for recycling because they have less contamination to deal with. So we don't see these as competing, rather we see them as actually all being needed and hopefully mutually supportive. I mentioned already that, sort of consumers get it. People are already trying to make changes in their personal lives. US respondents say they're buying fewer single-use plastics. This is all, I'm sure, old news to you guys, so I won't spend a lot of time here. I just want to sort of further emphasize that, it's all about giving people choices, and that people really would like to do the right thing if they can have the chance to do it. So, this is actually something I have another thing I'll get to just say. I forgot I left the slide in here. So companies are working to meet evolving consumer expectations. So this is actually, I think, really interesting to see the degree to which brands like Coke and Pepsi, Danone, Nestle, and then certainly some of the other CPG companies, as well as retailers, are understanding that they need to do something. But I think a lot of them are struggling to figure out how to make alternatives work. So there's been a ton of pilots, and I'll actually talk about some of these pilots as examples in a minute, but it's really both, I think, encouraging that companies are committed to trying to figure something out, but also I think they're certainly trying to hedge their bets as well, because they see how hard some of these solutions will be to get to scale. So just wanted to sort of show that view of the world. So we ask ourselves a question when we think about reusable foodware, like what if, so what if you could get your to-go cappuccino in a reusable cup? It gets, scanned or somehow, tracked as you check out. And then it's very easy to return it to a conveniently placed bin at your office once you've finished your cappuccino or whatever you like to drink in the morning. Similarly, maybe you get your lunch in a reusable container, you take it to the park, and then you're able to easily drop it back into a bin when you're done. Dinner, you grab some dinner with your family. You go home, you enjoy a lovely meal, and when you're done, again, there's a convenient bin that you could put it back in. So this is part of how we think about what could be possible with reuse. And all of this is enabled by a reuse service provider of some kind. Now, this could be a business, it could be a nonprofit, but it's some kind of an organization that runs the kind of behind the scenes operation. So they're the ones that are picking up these cups and containers from these bins, they're washing them, and then they're recirculating them so that they businesses have them to use again and again. And that is sort of that system piece, like facilitating reusable foodware. If that were true, what would that mean? It would give businesses an affordable solution to single-use waste and also a reliable local supply chain for foodware. Something that we've been hearing more and more from restaurants and food service companies is how hard it is to get disposable foodware these days. It's actually the supply has become much more unreliable, and a lot of the prices have gone up, which is a struggle, obviously. Customers would have the elevated experience of durable foodware, and they would feel good about not creating waste while also supporting local businesses, we hope. And then in the community, reuse would create local jobs and also reduce litter in public spaces. So this is just a little bit of like the vision of what we think is possible when it comes to reuse. Cities would not have to deal with as much waste, and they could demonstrate sustainability leadership. And we've seen some interesting statistics on tourists actually really appreciate eco-conscious choices as well. Tourists want to feel good on vacation. So I'll just, I guess, pause there for a second. I mean, that's a little bit of how we imagine what could work and what could be possible. And I'll talk a bit more about the mechanics of that, if that's interesting. This definitely imagines it as a system at a certain amount of scale. This vision is obviously not just one restaurant doing it on their own. It would be many, many restaurants and other food service places doing it together. I think that's where we'd like to get to, but there's a lot of different paths to get there. And obviously leadership is needed along the way to make sure that there are people willing to say, I'll go first, because that's not something that you can't take that for granted. Just thinking a little bit about what, when we talk about reusable foodware systems, what are we talking about? What are some of the specific elements of a reusable foodware system? Obviously, there's containers, and we think it's pretty important that containers have a unique ID. This can be accomplished with a QR code. There can also be other ways of doing that. RFID or NFC chips are an option, but we believe it's important to be able to track individual containers and to know what's happening with individual containers. So they go out, they come back. That's of course assuming that they're shared in a system. An alternative is if people want to bring things from home, then the unique ID is less important. But obviously, you need some kind of cup and container that you can be taking somewhere and then using. Technology. So there's a lot of different people working on this right now and trying to figure out how do we. It's really in service of getting things back. So if you're putting a nice stainless steel cup or container out into the world, we know these systems work best if we can use those containers and cups many, 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 many times over the course of their lifetime. But if you don't get them back, it's an economic strain on the system, and it also erodes the environmental advantage. If you've created something and only used it a few times. So technology is a way to engage the users of the items if it's a shared system, or even if it's something like my restaurant has an app, then it's a way to engage with folks and get them to understand the importance of bringing something back. You can send them reminders. If worse comes to worse, you can charge them a penalty if they've agreed to participate in something like that. So that's the technology piece. Recovery and redistribution system. So this can be as simple as people bring it back to a restaurant where where they borrowed it in the first place. European systems have very simple systems like this where you borrow something and you bring it back, and it's great. There's not a bin. Systems at a larger scale, we anticipate will need bins and that are pretty convenient to access. I do see, okay, there was some questions, but it was just about recording. Perfect. Barbara, I know you'll jump in if there's anything I need to speak to. So the recovery distribution systems, I guess, it becomes a more and more of an issue as you get to larger scale. But from a behavioral perspective, it's really important to have reuse be as convenient as possible, so people don't have to go too far out of their way to return something, because that becomes a disincentive over time to return things. And so having easy collection infrastructure is key. And then of course, washing. And washing, many different systems are tackling this in different ways. Some folks are finding excess washing capacity in their community. Maybe there's a restaurant that's closed a certain day of the week, and so they're able to use that, that washing machine or whatever they've got. Sometimes commercial kitchens have washing facilities that can be accessed by folks, based on a contract. Convention centers actually often have extra washing capacity, we've discovered. And then, if needed, and this is also often the case, you'll actually develop a unique washing facility to support a reusable foodware system when it's operating at a certain scale. And that's one of the ways that some of the reuse entrepreneurs are working on this right now, is they're actually investing in washing systems in different cities around the country, around the US, so that they have that asset. And then they can, if they build more capacity than they need themselves, then they're able to offer that as a resource to the community in various contexts as well. And then of course, there's all the communications and messaging and incentives and things that you can wrap around these items. So those are kind of how we think about the elements of a reusable foodware system. So reusable foodware is very much happening today. Again, we do think about this largely in this system context, but a lot of this also can apply to more individual individual programs or things that individual restaurants or groups of restaurants want to participate in. One distinction that I wanted to make just for clarity in this conversation is the idea of a closed loop system versus an open loop system. And it's very much what it sounds like. It's not mysterious. Closed loop is a system where things don't leave the property. So that could be a corporate cafeteria where people don't take things home. It could be a theme park. It could be a cruise ship. It could be a music festival. So there's different places where you have clear boundaries and things are not leaving. So it seems pretty straightforward to operate a system like that, because you have less of a concern about getting things back. It should be easier, in theory at least, to get stuff back. It doesn't turn out to quite always be the case, but in closed loop systems, we've seen lots of great examples of success. There's a few examples here. Cup Up, Ozy, and Redish all serve quite large, communities with their systems, and I feel like it's the easier option. I mean, not to say it doesn't have many challenges, but compared to open loop, which just has a whole other level of complexity, it's a more straightforward way of doing reuse. Open loop is where it's more like the example I shared, where I get a cup in one place and I walk around with it and I return it somewhere else. And that's a model where the tracking becomes more important, and the scale and the sort of the complexity becomes more important. Barbara, were you trying to jump in there or no? You have to unmute if you want to speak though.
Sorry about that. Just a question about the scale issue here. I'm amazed at the size of some of these. What's the other end of the spectrum, or maybe you're about to get to that? What's the smallest sustainable scale operation you've seen? I'm thinking of a community scale system.
So right now, there are reusable foodware programs operating. There might be a single restaurant that has, their own system. I'm familiar with some very small pilots. Ann Arbor has a pilot that started off serving, I think, 2 restaurants, and they've been up to 4, and I think they're adding a few more now. So, quite small scale there. I think St. Louis had a program. I haven't checked in with them recently, but they were serving 4 restaurants as a starting point. So the smaller scale can work. I think, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, there are specific challenges that come with having a very small scale program compared to a program at a larger scale. In that you do end up with people having to make a return trip that maybe they weren't planning on making otherwise. Maybe they weren't planning on going to that particular place, but they know that they want to return their container. And so there's extra miles associated with that. You can end up with extra cleaning, which can erode environmental benefits. So ideally, these containers and cups get washed once. But if I take something home with me, I'm going to wash it, right? I'm not just going to like let it be gross. And then when I take it back to the restaurant, they're going to wash it again because they can't be sure that I did a good enough job of washing it. And so there are some challenges of small scale systems. That said, I think every little bit counts, right? Like I think, reuse is valuable in all of these contexts. And something that we just need to be mindful of is, ideally over time, you do get to a larger scale system because it'll be more economical, it'll be more inclusive. When you have a smaller scale system, you only have the people who are sort of willing to make that extra effort, and a lot of other people will pass on it. So if you get a system that's a little bit bigger, people are more able to participate in it without having to be maybe as committed. And then the environmental benefits are stronger, when you have a larger scale system. But you have to start somewhere, right? We have to build these systems up, and that means that people have to have positive experiences of reuse. They have to try it, and sometimes trying it means, working at a smaller scale, and that's really important. So I hope that was there more to that? Okay, is that good enough for now? Cool. Yeah, and what's interesting about these is that they might feel large scale, and they are. I mean, 25 million disposables, like that's a lot, but at the same time, there's nowhere in the world that I know of that you can go, even a very small community, that's 100% reusable. I don't think that exists today. And so that's part of the question we're asking is how can we switch a whole community across, from disposables over to reusables, and what would that look like and feel like, and what kind of benefits would that create for that community? So even though this looks like larger scale than maybe you were expecting, even larger scale, I think, will be required for us to feel confident that we've really solved the problem. So, and obviously, I'll continue pausing. I'll do this slide and then I'll pause again for other questions. I'd love to hear from people. I know that you all are thoughtful about this topic, or at least about plastic waste in general. So I'd love to hear from folks. So a question that I always get about this is, well, how does that really work? So we've talked a little bit about sort of the flow of items, but the system that we imagine, that sort of that like community level system, one way that can work, and what this is explaining, is that you do have this reuse service provider that kind of owns a lot of the assets of the system. And they're providing reuse as a service then to local businesses. So restaurants can then pay like a reuse fee, like a per item is the word I'm looking for. They can pay a per item fee of, right now in the marketplace, it's anywhere from 5 cents to like 50 cents, depending on the existing service providers and where they're operating and all of that. And part of the reason, I mean, 50 cents, I'm sure sounds like a lot to some people, and it is, but I think that cost would come down over time as the system, got more efficient and more scaled. But one way this can work is you create this sort of like a drop-in model where you're sort of saying, instead of buying that disposable for 5 cents, borrow this reusable for 5 cents. And so again, giving restaurants an easy choice. We want to give consumers easy choices. We also want to give business owners easy choices. And so that's one way to do it. Ideally, the service is always free to customers as long as they return the item. So, there's different ways to accomplish that, and we can talk more about sort of different design mechanisms there. But that's sort of how we think about this working, is you have an entity that really facilitates this process as a way of making it accessible and available to as many people as possible. So that's part of the logic there. So I'll pause, and I just want to hear from folks if I'm talking about the right stuff, if there's other questions you have that I have not gotten to, other just things you're hoping to learn more about, and I can make sure to build that in as I keep going. Yeah.
Ellie, one of our group has a restaurant, has a small cafe, and we've been talking about this for about a year, and she went ahead and bought some reusable containers. She hasn't started using them yet because her customers have been asking, and we were hoping to get at least one other restaurant to maybe go in on that. And she was going to, the plastic was going to be $5 if the customer bought it, and then there was a tracking mechanism.
But that sounds very similar to some of the other smaller pilots that I mentioned. And I think there can be a simple mechanism. So there's a bakery near me that uses glass pie dishes. And when you pay for your pie, you pay a $5 deposit for that glass baking dish. And then when you've eaten the pie, you take the dish back and or you keep the dish, and I think people do a bit of both, honestly. It's important to set your deposit at the right level relative to the cost of the item, obviously. So you're not kind of giving away nice dishware to your community as much as people might appreciate that. My understanding of how that can work best, you talked about her like having a tracking mechanism. Some of the technologies for that, I imagine, would be just kind of more trouble than they're worth at that scale. So I don't know if she was going to do her own tracking or if she was looking at like there are different reuse companies that will like license their app or provide tech options. So that is an option. But some of them just will require a lot more sort of time and effort than maybe is worth it. That said, the getting things back is really important. So if there is a way to do that feels manageable, I would encourage it. I think it's a great endeavor. I think the one thing I could offer actually, which might be interesting, is we have a really good relationship with the group that's been doing the Returnables program in Ann Arbor, that's been working at a pretty small scale. And I think it's a similar model where the restaurants have bought some containers, they're giving them to folks. They have it's like it's a glorified honor system in the sense that they do track the containers, but they don't really have anything they can do about it, if that makes sense. Like it's a perception of tracking more than a reality of tracking, but that is working well for them. And I know they're going to work on a more robust system over time, but as sort of a stopgap in the meantime, the perception of tracking was almost as effective as the reality of tracking, which I thought was an interesting insight. So those are just sort of the top of mind thoughts for me. I mean, I think if this customer, so one example also that comes to mind, which is a little bit of a different model. I was mentioning to Eli when we were chatting yesterday that there's a salad restaurant in New York City called Just Salad. And you may have heard of them before, or maybe not, but they have a model where they sell their customers a specific salad bowl that they make, and then the customers bring the bowl back every time they want to get a salad. And I think they get a little discount for doing that each time. So it's slightly different in that model. The customer owns the item, but Just Salad has a whole operating procedure for how they can work with these items that people bring from home and do that. I'll pause there because I can see Joe, you've raised your hand. Happy to have you jump in.
I think is your next one.
Oh, I didn't see. I'm sorry.
That's okay. So Ellie, just to jump on what Melody says,
Yeah.
This is actually someone on our committee who also owns a restaurant, and she says she's able to use the online, is it Square, something Square? She's able to use that to track if you have, well, her model is that you basically buy the container, it's yours. And when you have it, when you have checked it out, so to speak, she knows it because there's a way to track that. And then there's a way to track when it comes back in, and she uses, it's called Square? When
Square is one of the payment processing
right. So
tools.
there's a way to track it on there, because she has a way. Anyway, I don't.
That's cool. Actually, I didn't know that. That's super cool. I didn't know Square offered
so
that.
I just thought you would find that was interesting, because it's going to make it really easy for her as the single restaurant if no one else joins. And I will just add that our university here, one of our universities, Washington and Lee, had years ago, apparently had a reusable container, takeout container model that they discovered that the students didn't care about the deposit. And so they were spending all this money buying containers, and the students weren't bringing them back. So they're looking again at it and how to motivate the students in another way. And certainly if our university were to buy it, get hooked up with a business that would wash the dishes, then it could be opened up to local restaurants. So those are our local details.
Bring
Thank you
it
so
back
much.
for extra credit on your quiz. That'll bring them back.
Well, I
No
was
kidding.
thinking, withhold grades until you return your container, but I don't know if it
Oh
would.
my gosh.
Yeah, I
That's
don't know if they would
intense.
go for that.
Yeah, I know my husband is actually a university professor, and yeah, this is the end of the semester, so he's getting a lot of emails like, "Oh, I just need a half a point." It's like it would be tough, I think, to tie those. Well, Gretchen, I really appreciate the heads up on Square. That's news to me, and I'm excited to hear that. So I definitely plan to look into that. And sadly, that university story is not too different from what I've heard from other university contexts. Is that students tend to keep the containers, and it's like a bottomless pit of containers.
Right.
Um,
Exactly. So
yeah.
I'm sorry,
No.
if you can't get the details on how to use Square to do that, Eli can help us hook up so that I can hook you up to the owner of this restaurant so she can tell you what she has discovered.
I would love that. Yeah, that would be really helpful. One thing I have heard from the university context is that sometimes it becomes a check-in, check-out system where the student can only have one container at a time. So you don't get another one until you bring the other one back. But then you just end up with them using a lot of it's sort of still a bit of a trap. It's not a great solution. So
So you have a question from Joe next.
yes, great.
Yes, thank you. It is great that there are so many sort of initiatives and examples that are going around, but I have a question to see whether, do you know, Ellie, of organizations that provide grants, to help, groups to do these kind of things? Yes, I'm sort of thinking in my community, there is a strong Korean community, and so lots of restaurants, and so lots of takeout, lots of delivery. And so it would be great if there was sort of a seed money, a grant to be able to help and motivate them to, who knows, they are so great entrepreneurs that even, help to create the cycle. Yes, the picking up, the washing, these kind of things. But I do think that something like, grants geared towards these kind of initiatives or something I would be sort of curious to learn about. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't know if exactly what you're looking for exists, but what I'm aware of is, Washington, D.C. actually had the grant program. I think today might have been the due date for it, but it was a pile of money that was being directed to specific restaurants to help them reduce their use of single-use plastic. So whether that was buying equipment or containers or, technology, things like that. So and I'm happy to send you the details in case, in fact, I remember the deadline wrong.
Yeah, great. I put my email on the chat so you can
Okay,
have
perfect.
it.
Thank you.
So they know the information, the organization and whatnot. That would be absolutely great. Thank you, Ellie. Appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. And there's a couple other things I'll mention. So there's an EPA grant that's actually today was the deadline for letters of intent, but the actual deadline for the grant isn't until January. And it's from the infrastructure bill. So it's infrastructure money, and it's available to both recycling and reuse systems. But it has to be applied for by government entities, so cities, counties, folks like that. So if they wanted to, the idea being, I saw your face, Joe, the idea being that a city could invest in a washing system that then would be a resource to the community. So then restaurants, if they don't have space in their property, then they can, access that shared property, or, there's other ways that they could use that, and it could even be integrated with recycling if people wanted to try that. So it sort of depends on what cities and counties are up to. There is also a guy who runs I believe it's a nonprofit called Plastic Free Restaurants, and I can get to his details as well. And he is committed to providing funding to any restaurant that wants to get rid of single-use plastic. So
Wow.
there are resources in the space to help with that. And that's just sort of off the top of my head. I think there's other things. One thing Perpetual is working on is fundraising for a fund that would provide businesses with grants to fund the transition to single-use reusables. Like, we feel like the ongoing system of reusables it needs to be self-sustaining economically. So it needs to kind of have its own way of existing. Exactly. But there are transition costs that go along with that. Maybe it does involve, need more space, or like there's, you need to retrain your staff. Like that's actually a huge cost of switching to
Right.
reusables. It's that point of sale where the staff is having a different conversation with the customer than they used to have. Maybe they're checking an item out. There's a bunch of additional stuff, and in restaurants, often you have high turnover. So it's not training someone once, it's actually probably providing training over a period of time. So we're hoping to create a fund that will also support individual restaurants and food service entities with transition support to reuse systems, but we don't have it yet. So stay tuned on that one.
But great. I think that all information on that area, I would really appreciate it. Thanks a lot. Excellent
absolutely.
presentation. I've been learning a lot. Thank you.
Thanks. And I can do more, but I'm happy to answer questions in the meantime.
Yeah, Rick has a question.
Rick from the road. Hello.
So the German recup and rebowl do not track. They think it's easier not to track the bowls and cups because that eliminates an awful lot of hassle, and people without phones can participate. Do you know how that works? How they get
Yeah. I'm having an echo now. You might want to remute, or I'm going to hear myself again.
Ellie, could you also repeat his question? Because I'm not sure everybody could hear that.
Yeah, you were a little quiet, Rick, but I think I heard what you said. You talked about how recup and rebowl, which are programs in Germany, do not track. That's not something that they do. And there's other providers in Germany that also don't track. And they at least report having pretty good success with that. I would argue that a big piece of that is that they're in Germany, where the population is very primed for reuse. They have really strong beverage bottle deposit systems. They already have really strong kind of reuse systems in place. And so people are accustomed to reuse systems. And it's more the norm, I think, there than it is here. A lot of it is also taking place more in public spaces. So it's people who on their way to the train get a cup, they get their recup coffee. And then when they get off the train, then they can drop it off. So it's a lot more of people in transit and using public transit, from what I understand. And it does seem to work well for them. So what I've heard kind of anecdotally, I guess, from reuse providers in the US is that the ones who don't track have very, very low return rates. So I'm not sure that that model translates as well to the US culture, at least not at this point in time, which is too bad, because it would be, as you pointed out, it's really, it takes a lot of the hassle out of it, right? That having a tracking system usually does require someone to have a phone, a smartphone, might even require them to have a credit card, or at least a bank account or something to, pay a deposit or pay a, sort of like I will pay a penalty if I don't return my cup sort of an agreement. So it gets in the way of some of the inclusion or accessibility to have those requirements, which is not ideal. Getting the cups and containers back is pretty important. So I'm glad you raised them. And maybe it would be helpful. I don't know if there's more questions coming through, but
Question now. Why not use a deposit? And then in the deposit, if you weren't getting returns, you would increase your deposit. I guess it's a matter of choosing. You're competing with the disposable, and if that might be inhibition, but it's the deposit that would motivate people to return it.
I think the challenge with deposits is just that it can add up, and that even if it's a very low deposit, it can be a barrier to low-income people to participate. And so it's not seen as an equitable solution. So I see a real tension here between the use of plastic reusable containers, which tend to be very cheap, because plastic is cheap. So you can have a lower deposit. But then I think, there are people who feel strongly that we shouldn't be using even durable plastic for these systems because there's health concerns depending on the formulation of the plastic and is hot food being kept in it, things like that. So there's a bit of a trade-off between a cheap container that, you can put a low deposit on it, and if you don't get it back, it's not the end of the world, versus maybe a more expensive container, but then you have to have a more expensive deposit on it. Like if you're going to use stainless steel, which is much more inert, it's just not as cheap. And then it's also nicer. So it's easier if people are more inclined to keep it. But you know,
One
loop,
thought about
yeah.
that is to make the deposit at least the cost of the product, but it's only one time. So if you recycle it, reusing it, then it's not in total a cost. And so if you were charging people for the disposable, then that would in the end be a savings.
Yeah, if you have a charge, like a parallel charge, or if you have a disposable, like a fee on disposables, like the city of Berkeley has a 25-cent fee on disposable coffee cups, as a way of leveling the playing field for reusables. And again, I think you end up with concerns about equity, about penalizing lower income folks, even a quarter, if they don't want to pay, if they can't pay a higher deposit for a reusable. I think that's something people have worried about. Loop, who you may be familiar with, they do reusable packaging for a lot of like grocery store items, like personal care items and food items, but it's they've done some pilots now in the foodware space, but they started in the sort of more grocery space. They've experimented a lot with deposits. So they've done really high deposits. They've done like $10, $12 deposits on their containers. And they've also then done really low deposits on their containers. And I don't know everything they've learned, but what I've heard is that, higher deposits do get people to return things faster. So I guess that's good, but obviously there's a huge concern. The idea is that it is cost neutral over time. So as long as you can get the deposit back, there's no penalty, but it does still have to just, free cash flow is a concern. Like people just may not have that extra cash on hand to be able to buy their groceries. And, right now, some of the pilots that like Burger King has been doing and that Starbucks is doing in Europe, it's a $1 or like €1 deposit. But if you're getting a bunch of stuff, like let's say you take your family of 4 to Burger King and you've got 4 drinks and 4 burger clamshells and 4 fry packages, that's going to add up to a lot, right? That's something they're paying, $12 just in deposit. So it's hard. This is, I think, one of the hardest pieces of reuse is figuring out how do we get stuff back in a way that is equitable and inclusive and doesn't penalize people for not having a bunch of extra money to throw down on deposits. Deposits feel really clean, right? I mean, it feels like a really clear way to do it. And Europe, again, has some really good established models. They have many of the bars and, like Christmas markets, festivals have that just €1 deposit system. So when you get a drink, you pay an extra deposit. Every time you get a new drink, you turn in your old cup, you get a new drink. And then at the end of the night or whenever, then you get your €1 back. It's really easy. They've got like this coin, it's really a simple system. And it's very, it's just very, it's habit there. Like people are very used to it. It's just not as clear how well that could or would work in the US. I think it might be interesting. I'll go through a few of the examples that I put together just to give people a bit more of a sense of what is happening. So here actually Recup Rebowl is the one that that Rick had mentioned, and they're working at a decent scale in Germany and having a lot of success, which is great. Bold Reuse is another example of a company that's done a lot of work, and they're one of the ones that has been like white labeling their app, for example, as a technology solution. Deliver Zero is trying to like be the Uber Eats of reuse. And interestingly, many of the, Uber Eats, DoorDash, other folks are really starting to get interested in how they can be part of the solution here. So I think stay tuned for a lot more about what might be happening there. And then these numbers here, these are actually a couple months old, so there may even be more at this point, but the reuse landscape was mentioned. So my team and I have this project in addition to Perpetual, which is called the Living Landscape of Reuse Solutions. And we track many different kinds of reuse programs. So not just foodware, but also bag programs, shipping mailers, reusable packaging, all those kinds of things. And so if you're interested, you can go, it's a totally open source database. You can go check it out, reuselandscape.org. I'll drop it in the chat at some point. But this just gives you a sense of how many of these programs currently exist in the world, which I just think is remarkable, actually, if you realize, that that it is hard. All right, so here's some examples. And I know, Rick, your hand is still raised. I'm going to assume that you just, because you're driving, you haven't lowered it. So let us know if you have another question at some point. So this is an example with Tim Hortons. If you're not familiar, they're like the Dunkin' Donuts of Canada. And they did this pilot. They actually did both hot and cold cups, but they were out of cold cups the day that I was there taking pictures. So I don't have a picture of their reusable cold cup. This is their reusable coffee cup. And they actually have a $4 Canadian deposit on the cup. And they also have a, you can see they have a 25-cent surcharge on disposable packaging. So when you order your coffee, you scan the, you can, get the app, pay your deposit. You can see pay deposit of $4 Canadian and get it back when you return your cup. It is a plastic cup. I believe it's polypropylene, if that's interesting to folks. And then when you're done, so this is a return bin that they actually had in the store. And I know they were working on getting some around the community as well, and getting other restaurants to participate. And so you can see, you can recycle a cup on the right side. And if you haven't finished your drink, they have a reservoir here in the middle where you can pour any extra liquid out so that it's not ending up in either the recycling or the return bin. And then when you want to return it, you scan your code, you scan your cup, and you drop it in the bin. This is not a particularly high-tech bin. People are working on that. Like, I think there's a recognition that it's important to, for example, make these bins such that people can't reach in and take them out again, especially if you have a deposit system in place. But we'll see. Another example. So this is a closed loop example. There's a company called R Cup, and this you can see here. This is it's R.Cup is their logo, and they are working with the city of Seattle, and they're focusing first on music venues. So they're using also a polypropylene cup. And they have one polystyrene cup, just because they couldn't get that format. They wanted like a wine cup, and it wasn't working in the polypropylene for some reason. So this is the cup, and then they have also a very low tech system. You put your cups in here. From what I understand, their cups have an RFID chip in there somewhere. It's hard to see where exactly it might be, but they promise that they do. And then they're able to, they use RFID wands to wand all the trash bags before they get thrown out to make sure that the cups aren't getting thrown away in the trash. So they can recover them, but before they go away. So that's another example. Starbucks has made some very big commitments on reuse. They've done some work with the National University of Singapore. And so that is where this example is from. And I don't know if I have the second slide here. I don't, but they've made a commitment that by 2025, every customer will be able to bring their own cup or borrow a cup at all of their stores in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. So that's a big commitment that they've made, that they're trying to figure out how to get that done. But you can see they've got different models of cups, and they are working on making that real. Vital is another example from Germany. The Germans are definitely a great example. Germany has had a lot of success with these programs. Vital is focusing on takeout food, and you can see this is what their containers look like. They do use tracking. You can see they have a code here, and I imagine there's a code on the lid of this. Yeah, you can see the code here. So that's how they've been doing that, and they've had tremendous success and have been growing like crazy, from what I understand. Another example from the UK is called Club Zero. They have, I think, both cups and containers, sort of like Recup and Rebowl. And they've designed these sort of special collection bins that are like little crates, but things nest inside that are meant to be pretty tidy. And they've also gotten a lot of traction in the UK. An example from Spain is a company called Boomerang. Looks a lot like what you've seen elsewhere: QR code, container, cup, tracking app, and containers. So this is like a penalty model. So containers are free to use if they're returned within 15 days, and they claim an over 98% return rate. So that's impressive. Dispatch Goods operates largely in San Francisco, and they are also operating at a decent scale. They offer they work with different restaurants, but they also do grocery delivery, which is unique. That's not true of all the container companies. One thing I've heard anecdotally is that people, even people who are like super committed to reuse, everyone has their like guilty stash of dispatch goods containers in their cabinet. And it's become a sort of like almost a trope, I guess, in San Francisco, is people are like, oh, like we've all got our like guilty cabinet here. So even people who are super committed to do the right thing need incentives and reminders, and they need it to be easy as much as possible. One example that people may be familiar with in India actually is the Dabawala service. So this is actually not a business per se. I mean, it's these folks that bring people's lunches from their homes often, or even from restaurants to people at work. And it's been going on for well over 100 years now. It began in the late 1800s. And one thing that's extraordinary, you can see it's rarely done in vehicles. It's usually bikes or, you know, some kind of manually transported item. And they process very large numbers of containers. And they have very few errors, even though it's a very low-tech system. They have sort of codes, and often it's not the same person who picks it up and returns it. They have a series of intermediate stops where people are handing things off to another Dabawala, and it sort of goes from there. So I just wanted to provide an alternate perspective of how things can work. My colleague Dagny, who has worked in this space for a long time, actually went and spent time with the Dabawalas in India to understand the system. So if anyone has questions about that, I could probably get you some interesting answers and insights. South Korea has another sort of cultural practice of reuse. It's really interesting. They do have some local, they have some policy that supports reuse for dine-in in particular, and there's definitely some good policy happening there. But there's also, I think, some cultural practices around reuse that are very supportive of reusable systems and of using reusable items. So just wanted to flag that as well. And I think, okay, that's the last example. So let me just, I guess I'll stop sharing again and just see if people have questions or comments on some of the examples, or I know it's not speaking directly to like the one restaurant model, but just giving you some inspiration about what else is happening in the world and how these things are growing up. Yes, Barbara?
You mentioned that Starbucks has an initiative to evolve to reusables in many places in the world, but the US was not on the list. Is that the case, that they're not really envisioning it for the US? And if so, what's the story behind that?
The public commitments that I'm aware of for them are just the Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. But I know they've been doing, they're piloting, you know, I think they're just figuring it out. I don't think they've given up on the US. I think their commitment to reuse, like they are really trying to figure out a model that will work. They also operate at such a large scale that my understanding is they can't do it all at once. So I think they're prioritizing some of the markets that they perceive as being more ready for it and more demanding of it. Frankly, there's legislation coming in Europe that they have to comply with. So it makes sense for them to be starting there. But I don't think it's a vote of no confidence against the US as much as a sequencing strategy and an opportunity for them to learn a little bit more about how things work in other places and then see what they can adapt for the US market. Obviously, they'll have to do, you know, other testing here as well, but that's all I know.
I know I've had the experience at individual Starbucks stores of just bringing my own reusable and asking them to fill it, and they have.
Mm-hmm. I would say they usually do. Sometimes at airports, you get a little bit more pushback. They want to pour it in a disposable cup and then you can put it in your travel mug. But yeah, I mean, Starbucks has the policy, and of course, COVID got everything was a little confused during COVID, but yeah, and they offer a discount for bringing your own cup. I've always wondered what would happen if they flipped that and they just gave everyone the discount and then they charged you for the disposable cup. You know, from a behavioral perspective, I think that would be an interesting experiment. But it is not one they're willing to do, I don't think. But I think, you know, one thing I've heard, not from them, but from other people who've talked to them and other folks just who work with some of the very large scale companies is that they have huge concerns about transaction speed. They do so many orders so quickly, especially at busy times of day, that they're really focused on cracking the efficiency code on that, about how do you check out, or, you know, how do you do this in a way that doesn't slow your transactions down? Because they, you know, at least I know in my community, like this, sometimes the Starbucks drive-through lines going like around the block and, you know, down the street, and that's not what they want to be happening. And they certainly don't want that to get worse with implementation of reuse. So, any other questions or comments on that so far?
Well, I would think that I support the concept of polluter pays, so therefore the fee for the disposable seems appropriate, because that is a literal expense for the business. So it doesn't, and that would present the durable returnables as being a more cost-effective way that they could avoid that cost. And, you know, and it's an investment, so that that would ultimately save you money. So when you have polluter pays concept, it makes it more cost effective to protect the environment.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. You know, something else that that can be a factor here is if you have communities where it's polluter pays, but it's also like if I'm charged by the garbage collection I create from my home, if I'm charged based on the amount that I'm generating, then, you know, that creates a double incentive for me to, like, then if a reusable program is really enticing to me, because not only am I, you know, using a better container, but I'm not paying to then throw the container away, which can sort of be a double whammy from an equity perspective also. You know, often that's true in communities that are just more strapped for resources. And so, you know, people end up having fewer options and then paying more for the options that they do have, which is obviously not the right configuration of things we would want. I have some more slides, but I also just feel like I want to make sure that this is the conversation people want to have and that you're interested in. So I don't know if there's other questions just about reuse in general, or about, you know, how it might work in your community. I think it's really exciting that you have a restaurant owner who's going to give this a go, and that she's got some of the right tools in hand to make it work. You know, we've done a lot of thinking and looking at some of the behavioral elements of this. That's actually one thing I was going to mention earlier, is that sometimes a deposit makes people feel like they have purchased something, and it makes them less likely to return it. It's not a sort of a black and white rule, but that's a trend that has been observed in some of the behavioral research. So that's worth noting, that, you know, the messaging around that is really important, really emphasizing to people that this is more like a library book than it is like a souvenir cup, you know, because I think many people are familiar with that model. But yeah, there's really a growing body of evidence about how to talk to people about reuse or returnables programs, so that you're more likely to get more participation, and for people to, you know, feel happier with the experience, and that you get the stuff back, which is obviously an important piece. Melody, yeah. Don't forget to unmute. There you go.
How do we get that research? I mean, that would be really important. I mean, just some little thing like getting a deposit or doing it a different way that behaviorally works better.
I'm happy to share some of the published papers. We have like a little summary of some of the research that we did, like a literature review of a lot of the papers, and I'm happy to share what we've found. It's not like pretty, it's not like well designed, or there's no graphic design. It's just what we thought was really interesting, but I'm happy to share it if that'll be a resource to you. So that's something I'm happy to go through.
Yeah, thank you. That'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you know, when we think about just the reuse systems in general, there's the, we think about 5 different aspects that are really important to plan for. So there's the economics of it. How do you make sure that it's not too expensive for anyone in the system to be workable, so that it can really last for a long time? It has to be healthy and safe. So you need to make sure that you're protecting hygiene, that containers are safe for people to put hot food in and eat hot food out of, or store it in. As well as the washing systems have to really be effective and efficient, and, you know, not just washing, but drying actually can be a big factor. Plastic dries much more slowly than ceramic or glass or even metal. So there's actually washing machines now that are set up to dry plastic. They have a vibration mechanism. So you actually, it goes over like a vibration kind of set of rollers, and they vibrate all the droplets of water off of the plastic, sort of like how if you like wash your Tupperware, you have to like give it a shake before you put it away. It's that same idea. So the sort of commercial scale solutions there are getting better. So it's economics, health and safety, environmental. Obviously, you want to make sure that any sort of reusable solution is environmentally superior to disposables, which requires some thinking at the system level of making sure you're not washing it twice, making sure it's not driving around too much. You're not making an extra trip. If you can avoid it, you can combine that trip with other things you were going to do. And making sure that containers get used many, many, many times before they go away or become recycled or repurposed or whatever that looks like. Ideally, they get recycled into a new container that can circulate once they get too beaten up or battered to continue their first cycle. The behavior piece is really important. So understanding the different behavioral signals and ways of talking about reuse so that people are excited about it, and making sure that reuse is for everyone. I think it's a shame that environmentalism in general has gotten sort of politicized. And so, our hope is to keep reuse a bit more in the neutral territory, that it can just be a solution we all appreciate and we all like having our reusable options. And it doesn't have to be about identity as much as just about convenience and a better experience than disposables. And then let's see. I think that I can't remember how many I've said now. There's 5. I think I've talked about all 5. We also do talk about integration with city planning when it's a large scale system, but I know that's not quite where you guys are at yet. So
you had mentioned that Roanoke some people at Roanoke had approached you. Did that ever develop?
We spoke with some folks there, but we don't have an active partnership with them right now. We'd love to talk further. Just like we'd love to talk with you guys. We want to be a resource to as many folks as possible, but we don't have any active project in Roanoke right now. I know we have more time if people want more time. I have lots of stories to share and things like that if people want, but it feels like maybe I've answered a lot of the questions that people had. Yeah, Barbara.
You mentioned the regulatory piece, and in particular, one of the examples you gave was that the EU is passing legislation that's actually going to require performance by like Starbucks or whatever. Where do we stand in that sort of world? I mean, at the federal level, we're in Virginia here, and I do understand that for the first time in about 3 decades, there's going to be a reintroduction of a bottle bill. I know that's not exactly the same kind of thing, but we don't even have, you can't even recycle a beverage container here in Virginia, in terms of deposit or anything like that. So what's the context that we're all dealing with from the government's role in things?
So I'm not aware of any national legislation that is pending. The national action on this topic has been through the infrastructure law, where they are directing funding toward plastic waste reduction, and that's recycling and reuse and other things. So some of that money is coming through Sea Grant, some of it's coming through EPA, and so there's different places that money is getting kind of distributed through. And there's a national recycling strategy, but there's not really anything on policy coming through in a more specific way that I'm aware of. At least I'm not 100% a policy expert, but from what's on my radar, there is a lot of action at the state and local level. And your example of the bottle bill, like I don't know exactly how many, but more than a few EPR proposal and or bottle bills that are being proposed in different states across the country right now. I want to say 6 or 9, sort of somewhere in that range is what I've heard. I could certainly find that information and tell you. I don't have it top of mind right now. And some of the EPR legislation is not just focused on recycling, but thinking about how you start to pivot to a reuse system as well. Hawaii actually had a very, they didn't pass their EPR proposal. It was up, I want to say it was over the summer, but it was very explicitly taking money from EPR and actually using it to create reuse infrastructure. And they hope to take another go at that, I think, in the next session. And then there's a bunch of other types of legislation that folks are trying. So there's things like, and I have a slide I could probably show you. Actually, let me see if I can just find that really quickly while I talk to you about it. So the different types of policies that I'm aware of include bans of certain types of foodware. So things like styrofoam bans, which, I think there was one that just passed last week, somewhere maybe in California, San Diego is what I want to say. You also have the opposite of that, which is like requirements. So there are jurisdictions that require compostable foodware, which is interesting because that can have quite a high price point depending on where you're getting it. And I know that getting access to it can even be hard because there's not a lot of supply. And then you have things like the Berkeley Ordinance where you put a fee on disposables. So a 25-cent fee on disposable cups. Vancouver, obviously that's not the US, but that was also a 25-cent fee on disposable cups. So those are the different levers that I've seen government trying to use at the sort of local and state level. I haven't seen anything like what we've seen, for example, in France. On January 1st in France, all dine-in foodware must be reusable. So that has a lot of the multinational chains scrambling. I know McDonald's has been piloting reusable foodware in France for about 6 months now, and they've found it really challenging. And many restaurants are going to be scrambling to, I think, to comply with that. And then of course there's the EU level, which is, coming on a longer time frame, but that's the one that's sort of most imminently hitting. Legislative action, I think, is balanced between some of the bottle bills or, reusable bottle systems, where Europe also has many individual countries now have targets that they're trying to reach on the percent of soda bottles that are reusable, the percent of beer bottles that are reusable, things like that. So that's definitely something that's happening too. So it's creating a better ecosystem in which reuse can exist, but there's nothing in the US that I'm aware of so far that really solves it for reuse. You know what I mean? There's sort of different angles that people are taking to try to drive the change. And I can't find the slide right now, but I'm happy to share it later.
Sure. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet.
Boy, it's encouraging to hear that so many other countries are doing a better job than we are. I wish we were with them, but
Well,
maybe we're close behind, hopefully.
I think it's not uncommon for some of these things to start in Europe and then to sort of make their way over to the US market. And it really, what I hope is that the companies like McDonald's and Starbucks that are doing this in Europe, that they're able to find models that work for them, and that then they're not resistant to doing that in the US also. I think if they can find a way that really works for their business, because they have to, then that can become a way to help spread it. I actually remembered that the chart is actually on the reuse landscape. So I'll just put it on the screen for 1 second so people can see. So you can see here, this is the reuselandscape.org, which is the website I mentioned, and this is the policy page. And so these are the different types of policies that may impact reuse, extended producer responsibility, single-use plastic bottle bans. So there's not a lot of those. As you can see, the orange, there's a handful. Single-use serviceware restrictions. So that could be like banning utensils or requiring opt-in for utensils, things like that. Cities that have made zero waste pledges. Container packaging materials is things like must be compostable or can't be styrofoam. So it's something that regulates what materials can be used. And then single-use plastic bag bans. Obviously, there's a ton of those. So that just gives you a flavor in the US of how that has played out over time. But it's interesting, the single-use serviceware restrictions is one that you've really seen consistent, like 9 to 12 of those a year for the past 5 years or so. So I would call that a trend. Yeah, and while we're here, I'll just show you, like, this is the living landscape of reuse, which is a great resource. if you want to learn more about just who's doing what and where. What else?
Hey,
What
I
else?
have
Yeah.
a question. I don't know if it was you that told me, but about the United Nations treaty to ban single-use plastics, which seemed like a pretty mature process, but we haven't heard anything about it. So therefore, I'm a little skeptical. But do you know more about that?
I just this week had a conversation with some folks who were in Uruguay for the treaty negotiations, and they were feeling pretty positive about it. They felt like, you know, it's hard, but that good progress was being made, and that reuse was part of the conversation in an important way. I'll share, I think I might have it open on my laptop here. There was a,
Tell our audience tonight what we're talking about, because
oh yeah, sorry, I jumped right in, didn't I? So the UN passed a resolution maybe 6 months ago about, it was an agreement to negotiate a binding plastic, a global, I think they just called it a global plastic treaty, I believe is sort of what the name of it is called. But this was the first session where the negotiators for the treaty actually got together and started negotiating over the terms of the treaty. And there was a lot of drama when it first got passed. There was a version of the treaty, of the sort of resolution around the treaty, that was purely focused downstream, and that was the version that the US was supporting. And so it was really saying production is out of the conversation. We can only look at what happens once plastic is in the market. But thankfully, many other countries said, no, that's not a workable solution. And so through some, I'm sure, very powerful forces at work, but the US did eventually sign on to the agreement to have production be included. So the production phase is sort of in scope of the global treaty. And in Uruguay just a couple weeks ago, I think it was like early November, I guess that's maybe more than a couple weeks ago now, but they, all the negotiators met to start hammering out the details of the treaty. And I don't have a lot of details. I'm going to put in the chat an article that was written by Kristen Hughes, who is at the World Economic Forum, and she works as part of the, she like leads a lot of their plastic efforts there. And so this is sort of her take coming out of the negotiations. So that might be an interesting resource for people to take a look at. It talks a little bit about what's in the conversation and, you know, where it might go. I believe the next set of negotiations are in April, and I want to say they're in Paris. And yeah, just the word on the street from the people I've spoken with is that good progress was made. There's still some key sticking points, but that, you know, it does seem like we're on the path to some kind of a real treaty. And then of course we have to see who's willing to sign on. But hopefully the US will be a champion for the right causes.
So would it be like the Paris Climate Accord, where it's an executive agreement versus a treaty that requires 2/3 vote to ratify a treaty that can't be repealed by a new president?
I don't know, actually. It's a great question. I think that's one of the things that they're trying to figure out is what would a legally binding treaty look like how, like what version of legally binding would it be? Because I think the goal is for it to be a treaty that people can't give up on when they decide that they've changed their minds, that they would have real teeth. I think that's an intention, but I don't think they've figured out the mechanisms yet.
But it would also require that there be systemic regulations in order to fulfill the terms of a treaty. Like the Paris Climate Accords didn't actually have legally binding requirements. It was just an intent. You know, the country said they would do at least as much as they said they would do. It didn't add up to what we need to do.
Mm-hmm.
But even there was no legal consequences for not doing what they said they were going to do. Yeah.
My impression is that there's a real sense that these negotiators have worked very hard to learn the lessons of the climate treaty to avoid exactly those pitfalls that you're describing. But I do think there's still debate about about the exact structure of it, about will countries set goals and how, like, what will be the basis for those goals. And I think there's also equity questions. You know, right now there's certain countries that are dealing with a lot of waste from other countries, you know, and so how does that get addressed in a treaty context as well? So I hope we can learn more about the process. You know, the people I've talked to have only given me sort of somewhat high level comments. Our newsletter, we're hoping to get some of the people that I talked to this week. They're with PR3, which is a nonprofit which is focused on reusable standards. So making sure that as we develop reuse systems, we have good interoperability across those systems. They were there as part of the negotiation, and I asked them to write a sort of a what happened in Uruguay piece for our next newsletter. So I'll certainly share that with you all if we get something like that through.
Well, I think it's exciting that there is a global recognition, and really it is a global problem because the pollution in the ocean is really affecting all the nations. It's just floating everywhere in the world. So it's disgusting, but it's recognized. So therefore I see hope in the recognition is the step towards addressing it.
Yeah, you got to know you have a problem and be willing to admit it. And I think that's where some of the discussions, the hearings today were slightly disheartening, is the sort of lack of recognition. And I do feel like it's important to be precise in how we talk about this. You know, I don't think we want to villainize all plastic, but certainly like single-use disposable plastic, many of those applications we could do a lot better as a society.
Right. And then the other issue is when we do manage to avoid littering it and put it in our landfill, is that the plastics often contaminate the water that flows through the landfill, and in a contained system is leachate that you take to the sewage treatment plant and contaminates our biosolids.
Yeah.
So we're the victims. I mean, but actually in time, the victims will be more prominent because we can look away, as Bob Dylan says, and pretend we just don't see. Yeah. And so recognition is a huge part of solving the problem.
Yeah, I think it really is. And I think I'm interested to see what will change with more and more science about the health impacts of plastic, especially in food applications, because there's some very real impacts. And I just don't think, I think most people aren't aware of what those are.
Right. And those also incur cost, real literal money cost, quality of life.
Yeah.
But it's just the disconnect between those who profit and those who pay is why there's a desensitized system. Not people, the economy is not sensitive to the feedback loops.
Ellie, if you can go to that Senate hearing today, and the first person that presented was this Dr. Pete Myers, and he totally just zoomed in on the human health aspect. And of course, the fact that there could be no sperm count by 2040 was one of the pieces of data. And the autism and ADHD and everything that he is directly connecting with the plastic toxicity.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, it's really grim, unfortunately.
Thank you, Ellie. Yeah, this has been wonderful. Thank you.
I think you have a question from Rick also.
All right, Rick, you're back. Still driving, maybe.
I found a rest area.
Oh, okay.
Good, I'm glad.
Great. What's your question?
So Joe and I are from Fairfax County, Virginia, and we belong to a small environmental group. And apparently we're going to start pushing for the same thing because but we're both retired and we don't want to start up the company that does the collecting and the washing. So if we don't go with that model, how could we encourage the reusables within our community?
Have you talked with any restaurants about their level of interest?
Not yet, because yeah, that's a big step. And if I do get that, I don't know where to go with that. That's the, if they're
Yeah.
interested, I'm not sure what, I've gone around with Aussies to retirement homes and I do very
Mm.
well, pushing that. But, if I can't get a group of restaurants and say, oh, well, I don't want to do it, So that's my stumbling block right now.
I hear you. I do hear, yeah, thank you for meeting. I do hear an echo. Otherwise, I wish I had an easier solution for you. I think that, from my perspective, it is about finding someone who wants to run the service, because in our experience, individual restaurant owners, it's really hard for them to do it on their own. You really have to go above and beyond, and many of them, like, are already, it's so hard, right? It's so hard to be an independent restaurant owner already, that like it's too much to ask them to do more, and to go above and beyond in this area. I don't think it would take a huge amount of volume to get a company interested in coming to support in that way, but it does require investment. So you have to find a company that's willing to come and put some investment in, and sort of get a system like that up and running. My hope, and I don't know what time frame you're thinking about, but this is what Perpetual is trying to work on at the community level, is to work in such a way that we get restaurants on board, so that you can demonstrate enough volume to get a provider to come in and operate a system in a way that will be economical for those restaurants. So at a big enough scale that the price is low enough. That's kind of our best idea so far. And I just think we really do see this as a systems change problem. And I struggle to see how the individual parties in the system can solve the whole problem on their own. Like, you do need folks to kind of come together to create a solution that works for a collective. It's hard to do it on too small of a scale. You can, but it won't work over the long term. It can be a starting point to something bigger, but I think it's really hard to have a really small system, and other than under extraordinary circumstances, to have a small system that can work on its own for a really long time. So I don't know, that's probably not quite what you wanted to hear, but I'm happy to share, with the resources I do have, and see if those can be helpful. But part of what we're trying to prove with Perpetual, and doing this in a couple of small cities to start, is to create a model that then it's easy to replicate that in other places. So you'd sort of have a way to take an existing system and the word would not be franchise, but it would just be more create a way for a system like this to work that could be adopted in other communities.
Yeah, role models. We want role models.
Mm-hmm.
But somebody has to be the leader to develop a new idea.
Mm-hmm. Well, Eli, I know you've done a lot of thinking about this, and I mean, I do kind of love your idea of containers as currency. And I feel like there could be a world in which something like that works, but I think it sort of depends on the community also. Different communities have different cultures around that kind of thing. It might work in some places, but not others. And that's something else that we're trying to learn is, what are some of the common things that typically work everywhere? And what are some of the things you need to tweak a little bit when you're going from one place to another, just because of how people behave and what people are used to, what the context is.
Yeah. But also building the value of preventing waste just in general.
Mm.
And currently we're in the culture of just flush and dispose and forget.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a big cultural obstacle to get across, but it's the one I believe we can. And because I believe we can, I can keep nurturing the idea. Because if I say, well, they'll never do that, then we may as well quit. And that's a very dark place. So I
absolutely believe it's possible. But I think we need to be realistic about at what levels we can, the system can operate. Like, what can a small group of committed citizens do? What can a small group of restaurants do? What can a larger group of restaurants do? And just really tailoring the approach, based on sort of different levels of what success looks like, and then, building and building and building. And I think that's how we get there.
Good. Yeah, and I appreciate your work on this. And that's what we look for, partners like your reaches over the nation. And our primary emphasis is on Rockbridge County, but we're in the nation and we're affected by the systemic policies of the nation.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like it's still relevant for us to look at these larger scales and to be educated so that when the moment does arrive, that we can support that grassroots that would allow that change.
Mm-hmm. Barbara, did you have another question?
I'll just make a comment that for those of us in our third act here, environmentally speaking, probably remember the days when we didn't have this kind of stuff. It's not really, it's almost a return to an ethic that we used to have, or maybe it wasn't an ethic, maybe it was an economic necessity, but that's part of the picture. When the milkman brought your milk to your front door and you put the empty bottles in and they came back, and we still have a dairy down here that has returnable glass bottles. When your Coca-Cola and everything, the bottles went back. When cans were valued currency for kids who wanted a little spending money at the candy store, you go out and find some, tossed aside returnable containers, cleaned them up and got some money for them, that kind of thing. So, we didn't used to have all this disposable stuff. To be in containers, you used to be able to bring a container to the market, weigh it, and then put your stuff in, and then pay for the net.
The bottle system, the Coke and the Pepsi bottles, of course, they were proprietary, so you had to. But the interesting thing is that they were redeemable at all the stores, not just the one you bought it from. So in that way, it was sort of like open loop. In that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And that still exists in other parts of the world. They've just done a lot, done away with it. Interestingly, for companies like Coke, the US is a market that they actually do more fountain drinks than they do. Oh, they don't. No, they do more fountain drinks in the US than they do in other markets, not more than bottles. But it raises an interesting question of like, can you pivot from that model to a refill model, and skip the bottle completely? But we bring a cup. I'm bringing my cup to the fountain, and you've probably seen they've got like their fancy machines with all the different drinks in them. So
they mix it up. They got the goop and they put it in the water, and that reduces shipping cost and energy effort and all that. Well, there's a lot of good solutions out there. So I think we should look at the problems and be honest about the problems, but also be expansive in imagining the solutions, because that's where there's a lot more upbeat energy and more happiness for us to believe in solutions and take steps towards those things. I appreciate you presenting for us, Ellie. This has been a good talk, and if we can support you in any way, let us know. And if you have developments that we can support, just like I say, let us know.
Thank you so much. I hope this was interesting. I don't know if I hit quite the right, points, but hopefully it's a good resource, and people are welcome to reach out to me with further questions. Happy to share the resources that we have on all of this. And likewise, I'm happy for us to keep in touch and, follow your journey, and you can follow ours, and hopefully we can, get there together.
That's right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ellie. Appreciate it.
So much. Yeah, I really appreciate all of you for joining tonight. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody. Stay warm.
Thank you.